welcome to the very first episode of Absolutely Zero Knowledge. And I'm welcomed by Matej. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all good, thank you. And yeah, first of all, I guess a massive thank you for joining me on what is going to be our inaugural episode. But yeah, we're just going to run with it. I've put it out to the world on LinkedIn, and it seems to have had a decent response. And I guess the aim is just to talk about absolutely everything related to zero knowledge and the world of zero knowledge proofs. And I guess I used the pun that everyone has used probably 100 times before, but I genuinely do have next to zero knowledge about this space, which is, I guess, selfishly why I want to speak to people like you. But I think there's certainly a captive audience of people who, are in the space already, who want to get into the space, who have just general interest in zero knowledge proof. So yeah, we're just going to have a chat, see where it takes us, and touch upon different topics of discussion. So um, yeah, I guess first of all, that's a little bit of an intro to what to expect from the podcast. But I ed and work at Understanding Recruitment, so we are technology recruitment specialists. I work in our Rust team, so we work typically on the your day-to-day Rust engineering roles. So typically do a lot of work in that blockchain space, and then I almost stumbled upon the world of zero knowledge proofs. So without boring anyone too much, I moved from our JavaScript team to our Rust team, which is almost chalk and cheese. JavaScript is the most used programming language out there, and Rust it's this little niche. I joined the Rust team, and one of our live vacancies was in the zero knowledge space. So I just thought that was, a typical Rust engineering role. Back-end work, distributed systems work, but just happened to be a ZK application. But I guess as I delve deeper into the world, I realized that actually it's worlds apart. And I was lucky enough to go to ZK10 recently in London, where it really hammered home what the world of zero knowledge is and the world of cryptography and how far removed I guess it is from your run-of-the-mill software engineering role. And yeah, I've loved speaking to people like you and yeah, others, clients and engineers in this space, and just keen to get a bit more insight. So that is very briefly a little bit about me and how this has come along. So do you want to introduce yourself as well, Matej?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. So my name is Matej. I'm a cryptography engineer at Lurk Lab. I started doing this stuff about like a year and a half ago. So I'm also relatively new. I know maybe like a little bit more than absolutely zero knowledge about zero knowledge. Yeah, so I'm excited to, just get to chat with you, try to explain all the stuff that I know. Yeah, try to spread knowledge, get people interested.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the whole value of it. And I think you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice there. So you don't have to be too humble. But yeah, I think it's going to be, hopefully today will just be almost a gentle intro. We'll just have a bit of a high level overview of the world of zero knowledge proofs. I think it'll be really interesting to hear a bit about your journey, how you got into the space, because, the space is growing all the time. There are much more research and use cases, which once again I'm sure we'll touch upon today and in future episodes. But yeah, as someone who's fairly new to the space, it'll be great to get your feedback about how to get into it, because yeah, I'm certainly having conversations with people now who are outside of zero knowledge proofs who are desperate to get in. So no pressure, but opening question. The podcast doesn't ride on this at all, but what
All right.
on earth is a zero knowledge proof?
All right. So I think the best way to describe a zero knowledge proof is as like an interactive protocol between two parties. So there's a prover and a verifier, and the prover wants to convince the verifier that they know some statement to be true. And for it to be zero knowledge, they want to convince the verifier in such a way so that they can show the verifier the statement is true, but without revealing anything about how they know the statement is true. So this is like a really, really general thing. And there's a lot of, different ways that one can go about this in terms of like the protocols they use. But there's also a lot of different sort of ideas or a lot of modifications one can make in terms of like certain things are unknown to the verifier versus some things that are given by the verifier to the prover. And so there's a lot of like modifications on this. So I think like the easiest example, I think just basically going through examples is the easiest way of going on, is understanding it. So the easiest example is I could, as a prover, convince you that I know the preimage of a hash function without actually revealing to you what that preimage is. So that's like maybe like the most simple example I can think of like a zero knowledge proof.
And there's that nice example as well. I always have to dumb things down. So it's typical, like ask ChatGPT to explain this as if I'm a 5-year-old. I did do that, but there was the Where's Wally example as well. You know, the Where's Wally books where,
that's right, yeah.
There's a massive scene and you want to prove to your mate that you know where Wally is without showing them. Obviously, if you pointed it out on the picture, they'd be able to see. So, putting a large piece of paper over that image with a small cutout so you can show them or that you know where Wally is, but actually in relation to the photo or relation to the wider image, you wouldn't have a clue exactly where they are. So yeah, there's some really nice examples, but I think you've rounded that off nicely. And I think once again you touched upon it there in terms of how sort of broad the space goes. And although you've just described it in its simplest form, there's so many different variations to it, which once again I'm sure we'll get into. But in terms of the use case, I guess it's all centered around privacy and security, right? So obviously that lends itself nicely to the blockchain space, but further afield. And I mean, where do you see this going? Where do you see the world of zero knowledge going? Because it's certainly, as we know, growing rapidly and gaining an awful lot of attention. So yeah, obviously naturally in the Web3 space now going to evolve further. And yeah, where does it go?
Yeah, so definitely the ideas of like decentralization and like trustlessness, it's like a natural fit for Web3. So like, privacy preserving blockchains like Zcash, where you can like prove that you have a certain number of coins in a wallet without actually revealing how many you have. Or like these ideas of like ZK rollups, where you can do some computations off chain, roll them up, and then prove that these computations were done correctly on chain. So these are like obvious examples of applications of ZK. Recently, there's been a little bit of conversation about like whether this actually should be called ZK or not, but sometimes you can use ZK for just scaling as well, beyond applications of privacy. So just rollups in general. Sometimes the non-ZK variant of rollups could be considered ZK as well, depending on who you ask. And so this is kind of an idea of using ZK as kind of like a scaling solution for blockchains. So you can like do a bunch of computations off chain. They might not be hidden, but they're just done off chain, and then you can like verify them on Ethereum or something like that and reduce the amount of gas that you need.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well that I guess the efficiency of that decreases costs, and yeah, ultimately the efficiency of the applications as well, which I think is a massive selling point in terms of zero knowledge proofs as well. And yeah, expanding outside of Web3 as well. I think that was a bit of a take home for me when I went to London back in September. I don't think it's just going to be limited to Web3. And I know ING, the bank, sort of even back, I think it was 2017, 2018, were starting to use different sort of zero knowledge use cases. So, for example, there was sort of proving that if you're making a mortgage application, for example, proving that you have or you earn within a particular limit without actually sharing any more about how much you earn or any further banking details, or proving that you live in a EU state, for example, without actually knowing exactly where you live. So do you see this sort of keep expanding into virtually every sort of internet or web use case outside of Web3 as well?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think it started out definitely in Web3, but it definitely looks like there's interest outside of Web3, and just the technology is vastly applicable to like things that are outside of Web3 as well. And so I could imagine it being useful for like people farming out computations to like an untrusted server, and then the server comes back with the result of the computation, but then also gives you a proof that they did the computation correctly. Or if you want to do this in ZK using something like like encrypted data or private data in order to ensure the security and the privacy of the people that this data is collected on. You could send this sort of data to a trusted server or an untrusted server,
Yeah.
and then they would be able to do those computations without revealing anything to the server of what's going on. And like you mentioned, there's applications as well to like identity, where you
Yeah.
can prove that you're a citizen of a certain country, as long as there's these protocols that exist in order to do that. And online voting systems, and yeah, so I mean, there's a ton of applications. I think one of the cooler ones that I read about recently is Dan Bonnet and a few of his students have a cool application of using ZK technology to prove like the provenance of certain images used in like news stories.
Yeah.
So using like attested sensors on the cameras, and then some ZK proofs about the kinds of modifications you can do to the images, you can be confident that these certain images are that you see in like a news story are actually coming from the place that they say they are.
Yeah.
This is in order to sort of like combat some misinformation and give trusted data to, or give trusted information to the readers.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that one, but yeah, I guess in a world where obviously we all have so much data, and we're ticking boxes all over the place to different privacy settings, in a world where data is becoming so much more easily accessible. Anything to sort of, I guess, protect that and protect our personal data, whether it's Web3 or not, then you can see why it's going to be such a powerful tool. So yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, we'll touch upon what you're working on at the moment, but just for you in general, obviously you come from a sort of strong educational and mathematical background. How did you come across, or how did you end up in the world of zero knowledge?
Yeah, so I got my PhD in mathematics from the University of Illinois. It was something very unrelated to ZK. So I did like mathematical physics, algebraic geometry. So like very, very theoretical stuff, very different from any of the applications that I'm working on right now. But after a little bit of time in academia, I decided to leave academia and sort of try out my skills in industry, and I became a software engineer. My original interests as a software engineer were in formal verification. So I was using the Lean 4 programming language, and we were formally verifying some stuff related to ZK technology. And that was kind of my introduction to ZK. So I started learning a little bit more, and the more I learned, the more I got interested, and I really started consuming as much content as I could. I just started reading as many blog posts, reading books, papers, watching YouTube videos, just try to learn as much as I could. And the more I learned, the more I got interested. I mean, it's a super interesting field of cryptography. And so over time, my role as a software engineer started moving further away from the formal verification side of things, closer towards like the applied cryptography part of the technology.
And I don't think I've ever asked, but how did that role at Lurk come about anyway? Was it just a typical one that you applied for? Did obviously your maths background and your academics, like we mentioned, sort of lend itself very well to the cryptography and the zero knowledge space. But yeah, I guess for people listening, getting a foot in the door in zero knowledge is pretty tough, I think, from my experience over the last sort of 4 or 5 months anyway. But yeah, how did that come about then?
Yeah, so actually when I applied, it was known as Yatima at the time, and it was one of the few companies out there that was actually maybe the only company out there that was hiring specifically for a Lean programmer. And so I had some experience with Lean, and I just so happened to live in the same city as the CEO, and so we were able to have a chat. It looked like my skills matched the stuff that they were looking for, and I got an offer. But it was only over time, and eventually, like maybe about a year later, name turned into Lurk. We merged, sort of became a different company. So our focus changed towards the Lurk programming language, and that was when my work really hardcore shifted towards the cryptography side of things.
Yeah, and obviously now you are in that cryptography space. I mean, like I mentioned already there, that from my experience, incredibly strong academic background in maths or computer science is virtually a must-have. Obviously, PhD education as well. I guess the research elements of that, and because it is such a new space, that there is just continual research ultimately, going on at the moment. And I think it was Ethereum Foundation of all their grants this year, sort of earlier this year, the vast majority of those went in the cryptography and zero knowledge space. So why do you think that, might be a dark question, which I might ask numerous dark questions throughout this series, but really obviously why is it that PhD background, for example, is so required? Is it because of the research element? Is it just because it shows you're bright enough to deal with the demands of zero knowledge, or what else do you think it is?
So I would say, actually, I have a slightly different opinion, where I really don't think you need to have such a strong educational background. There's just so many resources online to learn this kind of stuff. I mean, it helps to have like a solid technical background where you can kind of hit the ground running and understand the sort of mathematical objects and the arguments that are being given in the papers. But I don't want to dissuade anyone who doesn't have like a mathematical or a PhD background to like get into the field. So I really don't think it's necessary. I think really the only thing you really need is like a willingness to like put the time in and like learn as much as you can. And actually, I feel like there's a lot of people that I've been meeting in the ZK space that don't have PhDs, and actually there's some like really exceptional cryptographers who didn't even go to college, and they're doing like some really great work at Zcash and other places. And so I think so just as like a little bit of a counterpoint to what you were saying, I don't think it's necessary to have a PhD, and I don't want to dissuade people from trying to get into ZK if they don't have a PhD. But on the other hand, it does help. I mean, like I definitely had an unfair advantage in some sense getting into the space. And I think it was kind of like on two levels. So on the first level, I just generally had the familiarity with like the mathematical concepts and objects that appear in ZK. So like groups, rings, fields, elliptic curves, like all of this stuff was like in my wheelhouse before I even started thinking about ZK. So I didn't have to spend like, that year or long period of time learning just the fundamental mathematics you need in order to understand cryptography. On the less tangible level, though, there's kind of like just the skills you learn over the course of getting a PhD or staying in some sort of technical field like mathematics, where you can learn to read like this technical language that everything is written in, understand the arguments that are written down in papers, like understand the proofs, understand the notation that they use to describe like the various protocols and like the probabilities that different things are happening. So it really helps to have that like sort of technical underpinning, just so that you can sort of hit the ground running. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, that's it. Really interesting. And I think as the space grows and there are more and more companies ultimately, starting out in this field but harnessing zero knowledge, that I think hopefully we will see people with less academic background, or maybe stronger on the software engineering side of things, who hasn't touched upon cryptography, to be able to get into the space. But I guess right now, for example, if you're an investor who's invested millions of dollars into this new ZK startup, and as a CEO or CTO, you really need someone to come in, hit the ground running right away, to come and hit project demands, or please the investors. And I guess that's why in the right here and right now, when there is when it is so niche, that I guess there's that demand there, and maybe that's why obviously the mathematical side of things is really important. But I guess the caliber of candidates that they desire is what it is for those reasons. But yeah, I certainly think as the space grows, because it's discussions I've had numerous times already with engineers and management as well, is that there are only a certain number of companies doing this right now. So, if people are hiring and people want to get someone on board, then they're almost have to, everyone knows everyone, and everyone's sort of hiring someone from another company that they all know. So eventually it's gotta grow. You've got to harness, abilities from software engineers, or maybe sort of raw graduates, to upskill longer term, rather than just getting someone who's comp sci, masters, PhD educated, who's doing ZKs already. Because ultimately there aren't many people like you doing that. Awesome. I mean, that's really interesting stuff. And maybe you've dispelled a little bit of a myth there, and it can be done. But yeah, so in terms of a cryptography, now you're on the cryptography side of things. What do you do on a day-to-day basis? And like I said, it is, and you'll probably tell me more. It is far removed from just a typical, software engineering role. And I don't want to act blasé and say software engineers have an easy job. Obviously not. And I don't want to offend anyone, but it's not just sat at your computer working on, back end or API development, is it? There's so many elements of what a cryptographer does. So yeah, can you touch upon some of those? What does a day-to-day or week-to-week sort of responsibilities of a cryptographer look like?
Yeah, sure. So I would say I'm more of like a cryptography engineer. So as a cryptography engineer, I generally do things like take paper descriptions of protocols and then implement them in Rust, or take an existing implementation and find ways of optimizing it, sort of make the API better for the proving system that we're using so that it's more convenient for other people to use. There's a lot of different kind of things that go into being a cryptography engineer. Cryptographers maybe kind of err more on the theoretical side, where they'll design the protocols from scratch. There's a little bit of that as a cryptography engineer. Sometimes things aren't written down completely formally on paper, so you have to sort of take a step back, do a little bit of paper and pen work just to understand exactly what I need to be implementing, and then go in to your editor and then actually implement it. But cryptographers generally err more so on like the theoretical side of things. And so they'll be the people who are kind of developing protocols from scratch and proving security properties about these protocols, proving the runtime and like the efficiency of these kinds of protocols. And then when it comes time, the cryptography engineers can come in and then start implementing this stuff. And then maybe finding along the course of the implementations, finding ways to actually optimize and make it a little bit more efficient.
I mean, that's something I've learned right there. So a cryptography engineer and cryptographer, it's kind of, well, I guess it varies with all job titles in recruitment and from company to company, but cryptography engineer, cryptographer, not necessarily interchangeable terms then.
I don't think so. I mean, it is such a sort of strange field. Different people might call different things the same thing.
Yeah.
So it might end up being that a lot of cryptography engineers look more like cryptographers at certain companies than they do cryptography engineers at other companies. So, and I mean, there's so much overlap between the two that it's easy to end up sort of being muddled and kind of dabbling in both sides of the field, both the theory and the applied part of stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of cryptography engineering or cryptographers, I guess, where's your skill set best like? Because I know, once again, from speaking to people like yourself in this sort of field, there's quite a lot to it. There's, people can be stronger on the circuit design than they can on the mechanics or the folding schemes, and there's quite a broad range of, I guess, skill sets and responsibilities within that sort of role. I guess where does your skill set lie, and I guess how's your sort of time split across those things?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, cryptographers and cryptography engineers, I mean, this is beyond even just like ZK stuff as well. So, I mean, like big, Fortune 500 companies are like, and even small startups outside of Web3 space are hiring cryptographers, cryptography engineers and like security engineers to do stuff. So I can't speak for like the whole wide gamut of cryptography engineers out there, but like within ZK at least, there's definitely like that circuit design part of things. I guess we haven't really talked about circuits in any sense, but a lot of the proving systems that ZK proofs use rely on implementations of sort of like that function that you're trying to prove knowledge of in terms of these so-called arithmetic circuits.
Hmm.
And writing arithmetic circuits by hand is a very error-prone and bug-prone kind of practice, and a lot of these bugs can be like really bad, and you know, for some of these like privacy preserving blockchains that rely on circuits, you want to really be ensured that your circuit is actually proving the thing that it says it is. So you can't like mint coins out of nowhere, or run transactions that aren't supposed to be able to be run. So the circuit design part of being a cryptography engineer, sort of in the ZK space, is something that's really hard. I think it takes a lot of like practice and a lot of training, a lot of good mentorship from other people who have been in the space for longer. So that's kind of a part of cryptography engineering that I'm only now starting to become a little bit more familiar with. So far, my work has been spent mostly, like you said, on like the folding schemes, like sort of the protocol implementation part of stuff. And only a little bit has been sort of on the circuit design and circuit implementation part of the cryptography engineering.
Yeah, and that was a massive eye opener. Once again, when I went to ZK10 a couple of months ago in September, I just couldn't believe the complexities of these algorithms and the maths that goes behind this. And it was suddenly like the penny dropped. And you know, I've been to a few sort of meetups and speaks or talks within the software engineering space, and I can sometimes roughly get my head around it, but this was just on another level. So one thing I want to know is how you've got the circuit, for example. How ultimately does Rust as a programming language fit into your role?
Yeah, so when you kind of implement this function that you're interested in proving stuff about in terms of the circuit, it's not like a ones and zeros type of circuit. It's like a circuit where like the wires carry information that's closer to like an element of like a field, something like mod a prime.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of computation that's going on, and the computation is like really expensive. So what ends up happening is you need to have like a really fast programming language in order to do these computations. And beyond that, you know, you're doing a lot of these cryptographic algorithms in order to, you know, as part of your proving system. So things like some buzzwords are like multiscalar multiplication or number theoretic transforms. So there's a lot of like really costly computational parts of your ZK proof that you need to go through. And you want a really fast programming language that can do these kinds of things quickly, so that the user of your ZK proving system doesn't have to wait like a year in order for anything to end. So Rust is like a really natural programming language in that respect, because it's really close to the metal. It's it's kind of known for its efficiency and its speed, and so it's a really natural place to write a lot of cryptography.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you know, you might say, okay, well, there's other languages that are just as fast and maybe even faster than Rust, like C or C++. So why don't we use C or C++? The answer is some people do. I mean, there are a lot of cryptographic implementations in C and C++ in ZK. But I think Rust's memory safety, sort of the borrow checker and ensuring that there's no memory leaks, is one of the big selling points as well. So you can kind of avoid a lot of the, I mean, right now in like very large code bases, like in the Linux operating system, in Windows, these large code bases that are written in C and C++, most, well, I don't want to go on the record to say most, but at least a lot of the security vulnerabilities come from like things like memory leaks or double freeze, or a lot of these issues that come from manual memory management that you have in C and C++, which essentially sort of the whole point of Rust is that this kind of paradigm with the borrow checker avoids almost all of these kinds of security vulnerabilities. And so it's a very natural language that's fast, but also memory safe, so you can avoid a lot of that kind of stuff.
And I think all those things you discussed there and are arguments of why to use Rust in general, not just in the ZK and cryptography space, but
Yeah.
if you looked at any news article or blog post, so many of those things you've mentioned in terms of speed, efficiency, security, memory, safety, are why people are ultimately moving from C++ code base into Rust in general, and why these ZK startups are using Rust to implement these protocols and these designs for exactly those reasons. So yeah, I mean, you can see exactly why Rust would be used and why it lends itself really nicely. And you'll have to forgive me again, but in terms of Rust, then there's Rust-based proving systems, right? So you've got the likes of Plonky and Halo 2 and Nova, Bellman.
Yeah.
So how do they work? They're more on the sort of snark side, and once again, there's going to be buzzwords and keywords that I just throw out there that hopefully are in the right sort of space. But yeah, how do those sort of Rust-based proving systems work, and what's ultimately the purpose or the use of those?
Yeah, so you listed off a few, like Snarky, Halo 2, Nova, Bellman. So I can speak at least to Nova and Bellman and some of the Rust kind of ecosystem around that. So first of all, like Bellman or like Bell Person or Bell Pepper, there's a lot of like forks of it that exist at this point. But this is kind of like a circuit writing DSL in some sense that's embedded inside of Rust. And so this is kind of similar to like other languages like Circom or Socrates. So these are the kinds of places where you actually implement these arithmetic circuits, going back to what I was talking about before, which implement the kind of calculation that you're trying to prove. And so Bellman or Bell Person is the circuit writing DSL that's embedded in Rust, or is a circuit writing DSL that's embedded in Rust. And you can sort of describe your computation as almost very close to like a Rust program.
Yeah.
And then you take this kind of circuit that you've written in Bell Person, and then you feed it into like a proving system, sort of like a Nova, or if you're not doing anything like recursive, you can use Spartan, which is a proving system. I mean, there's tons of proving systems out there, like Jero, Mina, or not Mina. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of proving systems out there.
Okay, cool. And you mentioned Spartan, you mentioned Nova there, a couple of things you're working on currently at Lurk, I believe I'm right in saying, and yeah, ultimately a bit of an overview of your time at Lurk Lab, what you're currently working on, I guess more on the cryptography side, and because I know I had the pleasure of listening to John at EK10, which was an awesome talk, a little bit more detail about what Lurk are doing. So yeah, what have you been cracking on with there?
Yeah, so at Lurk, we're building the Lurk programming language. It's like a dialect of Lisp, but the whole point of it is that you can do incremental verifiable computation with it. So in the sense that it can run a Lisp program, but then you can verify the results of that Lisp program at the end in terms of a zero knowledge proof. And so there's kind of like the front end language part of this of the design, where you have to actually implement the language and all that. But then there's also the back end proving system, which is okay, well, how do we actually generate proofs of execution? And so I'm generally working on the cryptography side of things. I mean, it's a very wide range, and people at the company are working all over the different parts of it. But I generally stick with the proving system part of things. And so one of the cool parts of Lurk is that the proving system is based off of this newer kind of idea that's come out recently called folding schemes. And so right now we're using Nova, or maybe to be more accurate, Supernova, as our proving system. And we have a fork of the Microsoft Nova repository, which we have called Arecibo, where we are just modifying the proving system, adding new functionality, adding efficiencies wherever we can find them, adding new functionality that didn't exist in the original Nova implementation. Just basically sort of trying to make Nova fit the needs of Lurk and make it work for the applications that we see that Lurk can fit into.
And folding schemes, like you mentioned, pretty new technology, right? I remember, I keep mentioning, but ZK10, I think I've said to you before, but one of the questions on the application when you had to sign up was, what is a folding scheme? And typically, I obviously just skipped that question, didn't have a clue. Some people knew the answer and explained it really nicely, and some people asked ChatGPT. And at that point, I think it was pre-2019, where folding schemes in the ZK world weren't even invented. So people were going on about origami and were just way off it. So yeah, I mean, obviously they're working on some pretty cutting edge stuff. And what's the ultimate aim then of Lurk? What's the purpose of it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's this paradigm that I described where if you had a computation you wanted to do and you wanted to generate a zero knowledge proof of the computation, the old way of thinking about things is you would have to spend all this time writing the circuit, ensuring the correctness, getting it audited. I like some of Francois at my company likes to describe it as you take 6 cryptographers, lock them into a cabin for 6 months, and then they come out with the circuit. And so this is like a really costly, really time-consuming process. But what Lurk does is the circuit's kind of, in some sense, already written for you. So the circuit that Lurk is based off of is a very simple circuit. All it implements is the semantics of a Lisp programming language. So it just basically describes how does Lisp reduce its expressions and how does it evaluate itself. And so once you implement that circuit, and once you have like a front end for the language that can interpret that circuit, or that can be interpreted in terms of that circuit, now, if we give someone Lisp, someone who's familiar, or sorry, if we give someone who's familiar with Lisp, the Lurk programming language, they can write just a general Lisp program, and then, in their favorite sort of style of using Lisp, and then at the end of the computation, they would have a zero knowledge proof of the computation that they just described. And so it's kind of like a higher level way of doing zero knowledge proofs without having to go into the nitty gritty details of how all of the circuit stuff is managed. Okay.
So it's almost like, you plug and play. You don't have to, like you mentioned, go through the whole sort of, the background work, so to speak, in its simplest term, and it just increased the whole efficiency of that entire proving process, really. And I mean, aren't you going to make all cryptography engineers / cryptographers redundant by doing that, or will there still be plenty more sort of ZK use cases for them to get stuck into?
Yeah, so there's still plenty more. So so one of the issues with the strategy that Lurk kind of goes through, where you kind of write everything in terms of a Lisp, is sort of like, say I have a hash function, like the SHA-256 hash function, and say I want to implement that and I want to prove something about that. So you might, if we were working entirely in like a Lurk type paradigm, where all we had was this Lisp that compiled down to this circuit that we would run, and then we would generate proofs from that circuit. The issue is that there would be kind of like a number of multipliers in terms of complexity that would be there. So SHA-256 is already difficult to implement in terms of arithmetic circuits, and so then if we wrote it in Lisp, there would be like 1,000x blow up in terms of the amount of proving cost that it would take.
Yeah.
So the good thing is we have a solution to that at Lurk. We call these things coprocessors in some sense. And so if you really needed something that's like, in some sense, like very close to the metal, and you need it to be efficient, and you need it to be it's something that's not amenable to being implemented in this Lisp language, where you're going to have this kind of overhead of computation. You can still do the work, and you can still implement it in like Bellperson or Circom, and then call that implementation, that circuit implementation, from inside of Lurk, and you wouldn't pay the cost of this sort of 10x 100x, 1000x, or whatever overhead of these
Yeah.
cryptographic implementations inside of Lurk, you would be able to call it directly from inside of Lurk and have that performance guarantee that you get from the fact that it's basically implemented directly in terms of circuits. And sort of the key technology at Lurk that allows this kind of gain in efficiency is our move from Nova to Supernova, where the Nova folding scheme was sort of like the first folding scheme out there. It was introduced by Srinath, I think, at the end of like 2021 or early 2022 or something like that. And then shortly after that, there was kind of like this flurry of activity. And this summer especially, there was like a ton of activity in terms of folding schemes. And Supernova was one of the first follow-ups to Nova. And what Supernova allows you to do is, instead of just do sort of like a recursive application of a function one after the other, the same function over and over again, Supernova kind of allows you to have multiple functions. And so we'll have, say, for example, the Lurk reduction function, which takes a Lurk expression, evaluates it. And then we can also have, say, like a SHA-256 function, or like an ECDSA signature verification function. And so these more like cryptographically heavy, costly operations that we wouldn't want to implement in Lisp because of the extra computational cost that would be involved, we can have like these so-called coprocessors that allow you to get that experience, or get that like fast experience of proving, and still sort of have all that glue code written in Lisp that's easy to interpret, and that maybe would be more tedious and more error prone if you were to do that in terms of the circuits. So there's still a lot of work for cryptography engineers to do for, writing these coprocessors, and also, just making the proving system better that Lurk is based off of. So Supernova is a nice step forward, but there have been a lot of folding schemes that have come out after Supernova. So like Hypernova, there's also this line of work, Protostar and Protogalaxy. Just recently, there was another paper coming out called Kilonova. So there's just like a ton of cryptography that's still being done and still moving the field forward. So Lurk is not the be on end all, but it's a good start.
I mean, it's so interesting hearing you speak, but then I guess from a wider point of view, this space, the whole zero knowledge space is still, really very much in its infancy. That already, like you just mentioned there, we're moving from Nova to Supernova to increase efficiency and I guess cost efficiency as well. And I guess it's just going to be continual. There's so much room for growth, and all these, I guess, like we've touched upon numerous times, so many different use cases, the research that's going into it, the funding and the grants that are being invested in this space. But ultimately, I guess it's quite easy to forget that this is such a new technology, and this is something that's going to be around for years and years. And we're right at the start, and the room for improvement, what we think maybe is super efficient right now, like we've already seen with Nova and Supernova, that it can just be multiplied so quickly or streamlined or made more efficient, even more so. So I guess, I mean, if I was a software engineer or a cryptographer in another world, I'd be, so excited by the potential in this space. I mean, that's been absolutely awesome. And I know we're quite keen to, and you touched upon it at the start, but I guess a bit of advice for someone like yourself who, although, got that, that PhD background and maybe sort of slightly fell into the cryptography as you sort of pivoted a little bit from your software engineering role. But what advice would you give to, and maybe someone who's currently studying, or, someone who's keen to just graduate or keen to get into the zero knowledge space?
So there's just a ton of online resources. And when I started like a year ago, there was a ton, but within this last year, there's just an explosion of even more online resources that are out there. So I can sort of speak maybe only to the experience that I had in terms of learning. So, I started off like reading some blog posts, like Vitalik and David Wong have a couple really good intros to ZK snarks. But a lot of these blog posts that are written in some sense in like a style that's sort of like an older understanding of ZK snarks, where the proving system and the like arithmetization and the commitment scheme, they're all kind of like folded into each other, and it's just kind of like one really big protocol. it's sort of only recently within the last couple years where the kind of compartmentalization of the proving systems have gotten a lot better. And so you can sort of learn, now there's a lot of resources where you can learn each individual part a lot better without having to understand, all of the different moving pieces all at once. And so, I think one of the best learning resources right now is this ZKP MOOC that was run last summer or last spring. It was run by Berkeley, and there was a lot of really prominent guest lecturers who over the course of the semester go from very little, a very little expectation of a background to at the end, talking about these like recursive snarks and folding schemes and some of the cutting edge proving systems that are coming out. And so the ZKP MOOC I think is great. And there's even like homeworks and quizzes that are associated with it. I mean, it's already passed, so obviously you won't be getting credit or anything for it. But I think, there's a saying in math, like math is not a spectator sport. And I think that's really definitely true about cryptography and ZKs as well. So, it's easy to convince yourself by just like watching videos and reading blog posts that you understand this stuff. But really, like when push comes to shove, like if you sat down in front of an editor and you tried to implement something, would you be able to? So I think all along the way, I think it makes sense to just work on the implementations yourself. They don't have to be the most efficient and they don't have to be production ready or anything. But I think you learn a lot from just kind of like sitting down and working through this stuff yourself as well. So my experience at the beginning of my cryptography journey was, in Lean is a new programming language. So there was almost nothing implemented in terms of cryptography in Lean. So if we were to do a lot of the stuff in Lean, I had to sort of implement this together with some of the other people I was working with all the way from the start. So I think that was like one of the most insightful learning experiences for me, just like sitting down, reading papers, understanding the trade-offs, and then just going and trying to implement the stuff. And just working on it takes time, but it's definitely worth it in the end.
I think it's like anything really, isn't it? I mean, just immerse yourself in it, give it a go. I mean, from my experience as well, doing open source stuff, contributing stuff, getting on GitHub, what, like you mentioned, getting as much or immersing yourself into it as much as possible, but showcasing what you can do, I think makes obviously a massive difference, and can certainly just showcase what you can do. It can fast track you through interview processes, but yeah, ultimately giving it a go and showcasing your work is, I think, massive. There seems to be, from my experience as well, a fair few sort of internships in the space. I don't know whether that's just me because I'm looking at job boards and websites all day long, but there seems to be. And I guess why wouldn't you, if you're currently doing a master's program or a PhD program and you want to gain some experience, and a brand new ZK startup can get a really bright college student for a year, then awesome. But I'd check those out as well. Just try and immerse yourself. And like we said, it's such a small space now, right now, but networking is obviously massive as well, and reaching out to people and just seeing whether you can gain that sort of experience. But drawing on people like yourself, there's, like you said, there's so many awesome resources out there. Obviously there's the ZK podcast, which is massive. There's so many bits and pieces on YouTube as well. So just give it a go, get stuck in, and I guess see where it takes you. But well, that's been awesome.
There's also like a lot of really nice welcoming communities out there as well. So like the ZK podcast has a Discord that you can join. People on there are really friendly. There's like study groups going through like Justin Thaler's book, and they have this ongoing series of videos called, like, I think it's called the ZK Study Club or something like that. Where in the beginning it was like some lower level stuff, just like learning the basics of ZK, and then at the end, now we're getting invited lectures from like people who are publishing papers. And so if you just go through the ZK Study Club, you'll learn a lot as well. And then just to shill a little bit, but like Lurk, we have a public Zulip channel if you want to join that as well. We have a cryptography stream in there where you can hop in, ask questions about Lurk cryptography, try out Lurk, try to understand it a little bit better. So, there's a ton of communities out there. Those are just two, but there's a lot of places that you can learn about ZK Tech just by talking to other people.
Absolutely, and spot on about the community as well. Like I said numerous times, it's so small now, but it is tight knit. People know people, so get your name out there, get talking to people, and yeah, make sure you send me the link to that channel you mentioned regarding Lurk, and I can stick it in the comment section somewhere and share it if people
sure.
would be interested in that as well. But yeah, awesome. Well, that's everything I've wanted to cover, unless there's anything from you.
I think that's about it for me.
Awesome. Well, I honestly massively, massively appreciate your time and taking the time out to have a chat. And yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've learned loads. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear what people think. And yeah, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for having me on.